In the previous lessons, we learned about basic CSS selectors and combinators. Now we need to understand pseudo-classes and how they can work together with the selectors and combinators that we already know. A pseudo-class is a keyword added to the end of a selector which makes sure that a CSS rule is only applied under certain conditions. These conditions are usually based on user input or the position of an element in the HTML document. For example, a CSS rule with a hover pseudo-class in the selector will only apply styles to an element when it is hovered over with the mouse. Pseudo-classes always consist of a colon followed by the pseudo-class name. They are often attached to other selectors, but sometimes they don't need to be, and we'll see examples of that later. There are several dozen pseudo-classes, but only a few of them are common. If you want to see the list of all pseudo-classes, you can follow the link on this slide. I've also included the link in the lesson description beneath this video, so scroll on down if you want to click on it. Let's go over some of the most common pseudo-classes together. We'll try them out one by one in Replit. First, we'll start with the hover pseudo-class. In Replit, go ahead and make a new REPL. As always, you're welcome to call it whatever you'd like. I'll call this one pseudo-classes. After it loads, go ahead and delete the script.js file. Then delete everything inside the style.css file and the index.html file. Hit the Run button, and we should be starting from a completely blank page. Hopefully you know the drill by now after watching the previous lessons, but I'll ask again because this is important. What comes first in our HTML document? The doc type preamble. It looks kind of like an element, but it's not. Go ahead and add that now. It's a left arrow followed by an exclamation point, then the word doc type in all uppercase, then a space, then the word HTML in all lowercase, and finish it off with a right arrow. What's next? Our root level element, which is always the HTML element. We're not talking about all elements now. We're talking specifically about the element that literally has the characters H, T, M, and L inside of it. Go ahead and add that now. Then we have two more required elements in every HTML document. Do you remember what they are? It's the head element and the body element. Head comes first and then body comes second. Add those now. Inside the body element, let's make a paragraph element. Put whatever text you want inside of it. Then let's give it an ID of hover test. Press the Run button, and we should see some text appear in our preview window. Now flip over to your CSS file, and let's try out the hover pseudo-class. First, let's use the type selector, which in this case is a P because we're using a paragraph element. We'll try out the ID selector in a little bit. After that, add a colon and then the word hover, followed by a space and a pair of curly brackets. Inside the curly brackets, we're going to add a couple of styles. Let's add color, red, followed by a semicolon. This should make our text red when we hover over it. Let's also add one more for fun. We've been using the color property a lot in all the previous lessons, so let's mix it up. Add font size, 32px, followed by a semicolon. This will make our text larger when we hover over the paragraph element. Now, before we press the Run button, there's one more thing we need to add to our code. Do you remember what it is from the previous lessons? I'll give you a hint. It's nothing related to CSS. It's something we need to add in our HTML file. Alright, time's up. For those of you that couldn't figure it out, our style sheet is currently not connected to our HTML document. That means we need the link element. Go ahead and flip back over to our HTML file and let's add that now. Our link element goes in the head and it should have two attributes. href equals style.css and rel equals style sheet. Now our CSS is connected to our HTML. Go ahead and press the Run button. You won't notice any immediate changes. However, if you hover over our text in the preview window, the styles will change. That's the power of pseudo-classes. Flip back over to our CSS and let's quickly try the ID selector. Our ID selector always starts with a hashtag, so delete the P from in front of the hover pseudo-class and replace it with #hoverTest. The reason we're doing that is so that you understand that we can use any of our basic selectors with pseudo-classes. ID selectors, class selectors, attribute selectors, and type selectors all work fine. Hit the Run button, and then hover over the paragraph element in the preview window. As long as you didn't make any spelling mistakes, it should still work. Nice job. Next on our list are 3 pseudo-classes that are all very similar to each other. The first child, last child, and nth child pseudo-classes allow us to style elements depending on their position in our HTML tree. Let's try them out in Replit. Beneath our existing paragraph element, let's make 4 more. Again, you can put whatever text you want inside of these paragraph elements. I'll use test, test again, yep, another test, and one more test if you can believe it. Press the Run button, and we should see them appear in the preview window. Now flip over to your CSS file so we can try out our pseudo-classes. The first one we're going to try is the first child pseudo-class. Go ahead and write a P, followed by a colon, and then first-child. After that, put our curly brackets. Inside the curly brackets, let's do color, green. Don't forget, finish that with a semicolon. Now, what this CSS rule says is to find a paragraph element that is a first child of another element and then style its text green. So which one of our paragraph elements do you think will have green text? Hit the Run button and let's find out. Surprise! It's actually our old paragraph element that we made in the previous example when we were testing out the hover pseudo-class. That's because it's a paragraph element that also happens to be the first child of a different element, the body element. And if you hover over it, the hover still works. We'll talk about why it still works in a later lesson. It's related to something called specificity. Flip over to the HTML quick because I want to make a point now about how this pseudo-class works. Add a new div above our paragraph elements with some text in it. Hit the Run button and watch what happens. Our green text color on the paragraph disappears. That's because it's no longer the first child. So our web browser is trying to find a paragraph element that happens to be a first child, and it doesn't see any in our HTML document. When it doesn't find any, the web browser doesn't apply the CSS rule that we made. Now that we've tried out the first child pseudo-class, I think you can guess how the last child pseudo-class is going to work. Flip back over to our CSS. If we want to make our last paragraph element have purple text, how would we do that? You can pause here and try it for yourself, or keep watching and we'll do it together. Beneath our existing CSS rule, go ahead and write P. This is the type selector for our paragraph element. But we don't want all the paragraph elements, just the one that is the last child. So let's add the last child pseudo-class. That will be a colon, and then last-child, followed by a pair of curly brackets. Inside the curly brackets, write color, purple, and finish it with a semicolon. Hit the Run button, and we should see our purple paragraph appear in the preview window. Nice work. Flip over to the HTML quick because there's one more point I want to make. Add a main element above all of our paragraphs, and then move the paragraphs inside of the main element. After the main element, add a footer element. In the footer element, add a paragraph element with whatever text you want. Hit the Run button, and we'll see something interesting happen. Now we have 2 purple paragraphs. Why is that? Well, the last child pseudo-class works with any element that is a last child. In this case, the main element has a paragraph that is a last child, and the footer element has a paragraph that is a last child. So our CSS rule applies to both of them. If we only wanted one to be purple rather than both, we'd need to change our selector in our CSS file. Flip back over to the CSS file and let's make a change. We're going to try adding the descendant combinator that we learned in one of the previous lessons. In front of our rule, add main and then a space. Now this entire selector is trying to match a paragraph element that is a last child of a main element. Hit the run button and we'll see that only the paragraph element inside the main element is now purple. The CSS rule no longer applies to the paragraph element in the footer. That's it for the last child pseudo-class. Now that we know how first child and last child work, we can introduce the nth child pseudo-class. The nth child pseudo-class will allow us to select any child of an element rather than only the first child or only the last child. Flip over to our CSS and let's try it out. Beneath our other rules, create a type selector for a paragraph, so just the letter P. After that, write colon, nth child, and then a pair of parentheses. Inside of these parentheses, we can put the number of the child that we want to select, starting from 1 and going up. Let's try to select the paragraph that is the third child of the main element, so put a 3 in the parentheses. After that, go outside the parentheses and add our curly brackets like normal. Inside the curly brackets, let's do color :brown and finish it with a semicolon. Press the run button and we'll see that our third paragraph element inside the main element is now brown. It didn't apply any styles to the paragraph element in the footer because that paragraph is a first child. Technically, it's also a last child, but it's definitely not a third child. Now, we only use the nth child pseudo-class for selecting a single element, but there are a bunch more ways we could use it. In fact, there are so many different ways to use the nth child pseudo-class that we won't try all of them out together. Otherwise, this lesson would be an hour long. I've included a list of the ways to use the nth child pseudo-class here on this slide. Additionally, you can find a link to the nth child MDN article below this video in the lesson description. Probably the most common usage for the nth child pseudo-class is for selecting odd or even children of an element. We would typically do this if we had a big list or table of data with a bunch of rows and we wanted to make it easier to read. We would select the odd or even children and then give them a slightly different text color or background color so that we wouldn't get lost when reading it. I'd recommend checking out the MDN article for nth child pseudo-class whenever you have the time. Finally, we have 3 more pseudo-classes that are, again, all very similar to each other. After learning how the first child, last child, and nth child pseudo-classes work, I think you can guess how these ones might work. Let's flip over to Replit, and I'll explain more as we try them out together. We'll start fresh for this one, so go ahead and delete everything inside of our CSS file. Then flip over to our HTML file and delete everything inside of the body element. To test out these pseudo-classes, let's make 2 unordered lists. Remember, those are the UL elements that we learned about in the HTML lessons. Our first unordered list will have 5 list items. Those are the LI elements that we also learned about in the HTML lessons. We can pretend for now that this is a grocery list, so go ahead and put 5 different foods inside your LI elements. After you finish typing out the foods for our first unordered list, move on down to the second unordered list. We can pretend that this one is a to-do list, so go ahead and add 5 different tasks to our to-do list. Once you're done, hit the Run button so that we can see these lists in the preview window. Now let's try out the first of type pseudo-class. Flip over to your CSS file to get started. First, write out a type selector for our list item element. That would be an LI. Then add a colon followed by first dash of dash type and finish it with curly brackets. Inside the curly brackets, let's use the color property again to turn the text blue. That will be color, blue, followed by a semicolon. Hit the Run button and watch what happens. In both of our unordered lists, the first list item is blue. Now would be a good time for me to mention that a lot of people misunderstand how the first of type pseudo-class works. It's not selecting the very first list item on the page. It's selecting the very first list item amongst a group of sibling elements. So in this case, it will select the first list item in our first unordered list, and it will also select the first list item in our second unordered list. Now let's see a demonstration of how it differs from the first child pseudo-class, because right now it looks almost identical. Flip back over to your HTML. Inside of our first unordered list, at the very top, add a paragraph element with whatever text you want inside of it. Hit the Run button again and notice what changes. Unlike what happened with our first child pseudo-class, both of our list items are still blue. This is because the first of type pseudo-class doesn't care if the list item is the first child of the parent element or not. It will always apply its styles to the first list item it finds amongst a group of sibling elements. Now I bet you can guess what the last of type pseudo-class is going to do. Let's try to make the text green for each of the last list items in our unordered lists. You can pause here if you want to try it on your own, or keep watching and we'll do it together. Flip over to our CSS and add a new rule beneath our existing rule. Let's type li : last dash of dash type and finish it with a pair of curly brackets. Inside the curly brackets, we said we wanted to make the text green, which means we need the CSS color property. Go ahead and add color, green, and don't forget to end it with a semicolon. Hit the Run button, and now our final list items in each unordered list are green. Again, this is different from the previous pseudo-classes that we learned about, such as the last child pseudo-class, because our list item doesn't need to be the last child for the CSS rule to still apply to it. To prove that, flip over to your HTML. Now add a paragraph element at the bottom of your first unordered list so that the list item element is no longer the last child. Hit the Run button again, and you'll see that the list item is still green. Now onto the nth of type pseudo-class. The nth of type pseudo-class works similar to the nth child pseudo-class that we previously practiced earlier in the lesson. Go ahead and try to make the text of the third list item orange. Pause here and try it on your own, and then keep watching and we'll do it together. Flip over to your CSS file and make a new line beneath our existing rules. We'll use li again for the type selector, followed by a colon, and then nth dash of dash type. After the nth of type, add a pair of parentheses, and put a 3 inside the parentheses because we want to select the third list item amongst their siblings. Now after the parentheses, add curly brackets, and inside the curly brackets write color, orange. Don't forget to finish it with a semicolon. Finally, hit the Run button and watch our changes take effect. Nice work! Our third list items now have CSS styles applied to them. Final note on the nth of type pseudo-class. Just like the nth child pseudo-class, there are so many different ways to use the nth of type pseudo-class that we won't try all of them out together. Otherwise, this lesson would be an hour long. I've included a list of the ways to use the nth of type pseudo-class here on this slide. Additionally, you can find a link to the nth of type MDN article below this video in the lesson description. Now back to Replit for the very last part of our lesson, because there's one more thing we need to understand. Our pseudo-classes don't actually need to be attached to any element. In your CSS file, beneath our other CSS rules, make a hover pseudo-class. That will be a colon, then the word hover, and then our curly brackets. Inside of there, type color, red, and finish it with a semicolon. Hit the Run button, and let's hover over the elements in our preview window. Every single one of them is now hoverable. There are a few that don't change color. That's because of something called specificity. We'll learn all about specificity in a few lessons. We can also see that hovering over the unordered list element colors all of the li elements red as well. That's because of something called inheritance. Just like specificity, we'll learn all about inheritance in a few lessons. For now, the important point to understand is that our hover pseudoclass was not attached to any particular element in our CSS, so it applies to all of them.